me turn me off and let people start filtering in here. This is going. Oh, and we'll go in the order of the program too, if I didn't mention that.
So who is first?
Sarah is up first. Okay. So as people are filtering in to attend our 11 a.m. Eastern panel, I just want to say thank you, everybody, for attending. Welcome to day 2 of CrimCon. We have 4 panelists today, so we will be sticking to the 10-minute per paper rule. And we'll save all questions for the end. If you have any questions for any of our presenters today, please feel free to post them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We'll save all questions for the end, but if you're worried about forgetting what you wanted to ask, you are totally welcome to post any questions in there that you have while our presenters are speaking. And then, like I said, we'll address everything at the end. I'm going to jump in at about the 9-minute mark in each session just to remind our presenters of the time. And oh, before I forget, today's stream is sponsored by Southern Illinois University Press. So please check out their undoubtedly wonderful selection of brilliant scholarship. That said, our first paper today by Sarah Cate. Sarah, the floor is yours whenever you're ready.
Great, thank you so much. Thanks to the organizers for making this such a great environment to do these presentations. I've really been enjoying it. Let me just see. Hopefully you all can see that.
Good.
Yeah, great. Okay, so what I'm talking about today is the case of Mississippi as a way to look at broader trends in prison reform. So I'm going to be very specifically talking about this one state, but it has these broader consequences because the particular strategy of reforms, which I argue is, to make it very simple, is to cut costs to try to fix the myriad problems of the criminal justice system, is really sweeping the nation. A lot of other states are pursuing this exact same model. And as you see here, Jared Kushner, I'm sorry for those of you who probably didn't want to see him first thing this morning, is talking to the former governor of Mississippi because the First Step Act was largely based on what the state did in regards to criminal justice reform. So while it's the specific state, I do argue that it has sort of broader consequences. And to really just cut to the chase, the 2 contributions I'm making is because there's already a very well-established literature on the limitations of fiscal austerity-driven criminal justice reforms. And by that, we mean reforms that are primarily motivated and targeted at cutting costs of the criminal justice system. This is not reinvestment. These are simply trimming down and trying to shrink the budget of criminal justice reforms. Something that's likely to get even more popular, even though over half the states have pursued these types of reforms in the context of COVID and our economic crisis. So that literature is well established. The paper brings a couple new wrinkles to the fore. And the first is to very explicitly draw the connection between the development of the carceral state and the ways in which this created particular labor and public sector dependencies that will require the opposite politics of austerity. I argue will require public investments, not more cuts. And looking at this sort of dependency helps get to the core of why fiscal austerity reforms are not up to the task of dismantling the carceral state. And the second is a lot of people have written about how these types of reforms tend to make prisons leaner and meaner. And I'm just adding another point to this, which is that I argue, a key mediating factor of why that's the case is that these fiscal austerity, like tons of other policy areas, takes direct aim at public sector workers. And it is in many ways what's happening to correctional officers in the state of Mississippi that's a key explanation for why, despite passing landmark reforms that the federal government is applauding and modeling, the prisons in Mississippi have gotten more and more dangerous and chaotic. So those are the 2 points. I'll try to run through those pretty quickly. Just a little bit of background. I won't go into the details here, but the reforms I'm talking about passed in 2014, and they were largely designed to make the system more efficient and save money. And were heavily promoted by the Pew Foundation and other activist organizations. Right on Crime might be familiar to this story for many of you. And they were successful. The state has slashed its corrections budget by tens of millions of dollars. Not only has it reduced the budget, but it was projected to spend more. So depending on how you frame it, they've saved a lot of money. And some reformers think this is great. We want the system to downsize. We don't want to be wasting money on what many believe to be counterproductive. But I argue the context really matters for those decreases. So the costs are down, they have slashed the budget, but numbers not so much. So prisoners, and I also parole and probation are about the same and growing. So spending less, but for the most part, processing the same number of people in the criminal justice system. What does this mean on the ground? And I argue it's a signal of the tensions that the reforms don't address, which will stymie reforms, just as they have in Mississippi. So if you don't look at what investments need to happen, you're really not going to see a downtick in numbers. And that's because, and we'll look specifically at Mississippi, but this is true a lot of places, the construction of mass incarceration created these dependencies on these institutions and jobs. So in Mississippi, the flurry of prisons that were opened at the county level created a lot of jobs, public sector jobs, and also completely reshaped public works in the state. So at the same time, and there are shared developments that Mississippi went on its prison construction spree, they were also massively retrenching public goods. That's happening at the federal level as well. And so these two dynamics put a ton of reliance on free prison labor. In Mississippi, prisoners are not paid for their work to provide basic public goods like road maintenance, firefighting, trash collection, a whole gamut of public goods. So now the reforms are cutting costs, and they're taking away this last ditch support for basic public goods by closing down community work centers in order to save money. So again, from kind of a very high level, this looks positive for decarceration goals. Less people are going to these work centers that are exploitative of prison labor, but the state did not replace this dependency. And so county officials have scrambled and pushed back hard and basically found different ways of securing this exploitative labor, which I won't get into too much, but essentially because this dependency wasn't addressed, in fact, the state responded with just more budget cuts. County officials are pushing back against the efforts to downsize the carceral state. And I argue that that dynamic, it'll play out in different ways in different locations, but is bound to occur because of this core contradiction. And the second point is about the correctional workers. So one of the key ways in which the state has massively saved money is it's not paying personnel. So this is troubling for the fact that in Mississippi, public sector work is really important for the labor force. And the vast majority of people who are correctional officers are women and African Americans in the state of Mississippi. And these jobs aren't being replaced. They're also creating very dangerous, chaotic situations for both the workers and the prisoners. We're seeing massive vacancies because, as I mentioned, while we're getting rid of correction officers, we're not really reducing the prison population. So this means really tough working conditions that were already bad. Correctional officers make very little in Mississippi, the worst in the nation, and get little training, and then are thrust into really difficult situations. And this is really bad for prisoners. So a key connection to the staff shortages is a declining treatment of prisoners. Short staffing leads to very long lockdowns, which creates sort of violent tensions in prisons. Because of short staffing, in a couple of state prisons, nearly 70% of medical visits are being canceled. So it's having a ton of effects on the health of prisoners. We're seeing really high rates of homicides. This is all since the reforms have passed and the budget cuts have gone into effect, and a very high mortality rate. And that has been, in just the last year, cause for attention from the Department of Justice to investigate. And just one quick side note, the hard thing is we don't actually even know why people are dying, the cause of death in prison, because the medical examiner's office has also been drastically cut in its budget and is majorly backed up. So all of these indications are signs that cost cuts
1 minute
will
to go.
not get us. Yep, I'm just wrapping up. Great.
Yep.
So the key takeaways is my argument. What do we make of all of this? Is that we're going to have to invest in public goods to replace these dependencies, and invest in good paying jobs to replace the exploitation of prison labor, and provide humane treatment for those who are in prison. Can't cut our way out of this problem. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah.
There we go.
Our next paper is Collective Action Behind Bars. Candice, the floor is yours whenever you're ready.
Can I just get confirmation that you can see my presentation?
Yep, you're good.
Great. Okay. So hi, everybody. I'm really happy to be in community with so many phenomenal scholars who are working on incredible research. So my name is Candice Crutchfield, and for the next 10 minutes, I'd like to talk to you about a topic that I'm very passionate about, and that is collective action in social movements, specifically those led by incarcerated individuals. So as the program indicates, the content of this presentation stems from my graduate research as a master's student at Columbia University. And I came to this work as a student, an educator, a person with family impacted by the carceral system, and with a desire to take new approaches to this type of research, not just through criminology, but with a sociology and a human rights lens as well. So my project anchors itself in the movement work of both past and present organizers. And in conversation, when we think about collective action or movements in prisons, we have a tendency to think about the Attica prison uprising, or more commonly referred to as Attica riot. So it's really common to think about riots, or more generally, quote unquote, violence, but there is more to the story of movements within and outside of prison walls. So as prior research suggests, there has been a cyclical occurrence of social movements in prisons since the early 1970s. And because of that, it's important that we ground ourselves in the famous words that laid the groundwork for incarcerated-led movement building. So here on this slide, I have a statement taken from the United States Prisoners Union Bill of Rights, and reading it out loud really holds power. So it says, "We, the people of the convicted class, locked in a cycle of poverty, failure, discrimination, and servitude, do hereby declare before the world our situation to be unjust and inhumane." And if we can, for the remainder of today's conversation, keep those words unjust and inhumane in our minds, because honestly, to spoil the results of the study in the very beginning, it's that injustice, it's that inhumanity that is more often than not what leads folks to act collectively. So I graduated from my master's program earlier this year, but as I was beginning to explore the topic of collective action, the United States was experiencing what has since become known as the National Prison Strike of 2018. So in August of 2018, notably on the 47-year anniversary of the murder of Black revolutionary and activist George Jackson, as well as displaying solidarity with a recent prison uprising that left 7 incarcerated folks dead just a few weeks prior, incarcerated individuals began a 3-week prison strike in at least 17 confirmed states across the nation. So standing against poor prison conditions, unfair wages, mistreatment, and more, folks vowed to stage sit-ins, withhold their labor, and conduct hunger strikes until their demands were met. So protesting for over 24 days, incarcerated individuals relied on cell phones, which we understand are deemed contraband, their loved ones, and outside volunteers to spread the word, ultimately initiating a nationwide movement through social media, as well as news broadcasts and newspaper coverage. So with that in mind, I share that the National Prison Strike is currently credited as one of the largest incarcerated-led movements in the United States. And among other things, it made me want to spend some time critically thinking about the kinds of action that happen within the prisons and how they're talked about within our communities. So here are the 2 main research questions that I chose to ask for this project. Social movements have long been studied, especially in the field of sociology, but it is often more difficult to do this work with incarcerated individuals as the focus. So again, I wanted to examine the conditions that led folks to strike and understand the kinds of strikes that incarcerated folks were engaging in. Based on existing research and outside conversation with organizers in prison, I hypothesized that things like labor exploitation, concerns over solitary confinement, general prison conditions, and the behavior of authority like the warden or a correctional officer would be some major contributing factors to collective action. And these ultimately became some of my main variables. And research like this has been done before, but I wanted to bring in something new. So thinking about how prevalent talk of the 2018 strike was on social media and in the news, I decided to do my analysis using newspaper coverage as my main data set. So using LexisNexis, I chose 5 major newspaper organizations like the Washington Post and the New York Times. I also looked at USA Today, Tribune affiliated coverage, and then I used the AP as kind of a catch-all, hoping to catch anything that was missed by the others. So these were chosen primarily due to their vast archives and availability, but also because of their differing headquartered locations. So with that, I collected any coverage of collective action in prisons between 1980 through 2018. And as I was building and cleaning this data set, which really became a rhetorical analysis of sorts, I ended up with 107 authentic incidents of unrest within prisons around the nation. So I paid attention to the content in each article, making note of the location, any deaths, injuries, demands, and of course the type of strike and the reasoning behind each incident. And I also paid special attention to the voices present. So were the journalists writing articles quoting the warden or individuals with authority, or were they directly quoting organizers, that is, the incarcerated folks who were engaging in the movement building? So based on the amount of information I was able to retrieve from my working data set, I broke the findings down by the type of unrest, newspaper coverage, the years in which we saw most of the unrest, and I could even do a regional breakdown. So I kind of had a lot to work with. And I obviously have a very limited time with you all today, so I wanted to pull some of the most significant findings. So concerning the conditions that lead incarcerated individuals to strike, much of the demands present within newspaper coverage were very specific to individual facilities, oftentimes ending up in my category titled Other, simply because they couldn't quite be pinned down. But notably, strikes appeared to be motivated by a variety of factors, including general prison conditions like overcrowded facilities or decrepit living spaces. We also saw a good amount of concern related to the use of solitary confinement, often used as punishment in prisons. Not surprisingly, uprisings, more specifically riots, were often discussed in the newspapers. We all understand that prisons are often considered an out of sight, out of mind concept or phenomena for much of the public. So uprisings and riots tend to gather the attention of the media. But as a note, for the purpose of my research, I separated riots and uprisings because of differing definitions and different framings presented within the newspaper coverage. But in relation to answering my original research question, hunger strikes appear to be a pretty common form of resistance which I considered to be pretty interesting. I had an unrelated conversation about this with an incarcerated comrade who indicated the ability to control what goes into your body despite the lack of healthy or appealing food items in prison as one of the only things incarcerated folks have control over. So using hunger strikes as a strategy was and is really powerful. So labor strikes like refusing to report for work duties and general sit-ins like occupying space on the yard were less discussed in the coverage. Seeming to align with where we see some of the most populated prisons, much of the covered strikes occurred on the West Coast as well as in the South. And more often than not, news articles failed to include the narratives of incarcerated people, most cited people in power rather than the oppressed, meaning readers are missing out on an important piece of the puzzle. And these are just a few of the high-level takeaways from the data set. Ultimately, I hope to expand on this work, but I really do love a where do we go from here moment. So this study relied heavily on a generated database and archived articles, and it could and should be enriched with additional qualitative study by speaking directly with impacted folks. I also have to acknowledge that this study only looked at what was written about by 5 mainstream news organizations. So we know and we understand that there are countless strikes that likely didn't make it onto our newsstands. So I hope today's conversation gave you just a little bit of an overview about the importance of incarcerated movements and collective action. Again, using newspapers as a data set was kind of just the beginning. So there's still so much work that can be done and so much work that I hope to do with this. So please feel free to connect with me on social media, especially Twitter. I am always happy to share resources, dig deeper, or even just chat about things. But if you leave today's conversation with one takeaway, I hope it is to care about and uplift the narratives of folks who are incarcerated, and that's in your research as well as in your daily life. Their voices matter, their stories matter, and I think it's important that we use our platforms in really helpful ways. So thank you all for your time.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Candice. Our next paper is French Prisoners' Political Capital, a Qualitative Study. Martine, Jerome, whenever you're ready.
Hi there.
As in the previous session, we are going to turn off our camera because we have a problem of connection. So I'm going to share the PowerPoint. Okay, can you see it? Yeah.
Yes.
So my name is Jerome Thomas. Good afternoon. I'm from the University of Reims.
And likewise, good afternoon. I'm Professor Martine Evans from the University of Reims as well.
Okay, so we are going to deal with the notion of political capital applied to prisoners. As you probably know, the concept of political capital was coined by the famous French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu. In Bourdieu's theory, the notion refers to the social factors that make it possible for some people to become a politician and to be recognized as a professional of politics by the peers, and to be recognized as a good representative by the citizens. For instance, the one who has got a big political capital is the one who has abilities to know in details the institutions and the bureaucracy, or who has the skills to speak in public, in the media or in public assemblies, for instance. After Bourdieu, some French researchers have clarified the concept, and you can see the names of these researchers on the current slide. So they have clarified the concept in order to adapt it and to apply it to the understanding of the interest in politics of the common citizens, and to understand their skills to go into politics or to take part in political events, discussions, or debates. The researchers underline that not only politicians, but also common citizens can possess political capital. However, after reading these researchers, some questions were remaining. First, we wondered what was exactly political capital for common citizens, but Secondly, what it was for the specific population of prisoners. While we were asking ourselves these questions, two events that you can read on this slide and the current slide, two events happened and appeared as a great opportunity to observe in real life the prisoners' behaviors towards politics. Indeed, last year, on the occasion of the European election first event, French prisoners could vote under normal conditions, and this is the second important event. They could vote under normal conditions, that is to say, with ballot and booth in the jail. But to correctly study the political capital of prisoners, we needed to link the Bourdieu and follower theories with criminology ones. No work was apparently done about that, according to the extant literature. Martine is going to tell us about literature now.
Yes, so in fact, we had to sort of reconceptualize political capital. As you just heard, it was not completely relevant to the sort of population we were going to study. In fact, it was not totally relevant for ordinary citizens either. And in the process of doing that, we thought of Hershey's social control theory, which really sounded like the best model. And we ended up merging, which sounds a bit clumsy, political capital and social control theory, because in social control theory, you have concepts such as attachment, implication, commitment, and beliefs. And as you can see on the slide, I'm not obviously going to read it all. It's about having political socialization through your parents, your models. It's about being active in political debates and listening to the news. And it's about spending time and energy doing that. And it's also about believing at a cognitive and emotional level that this is the right thing to do. And it's a conventional activity that you might want to join in.
Most of the inmates in France keep their right to vote. Unfortunately, until 2019, in spite of this possibility, very few actually voted because of the complex condition of voting. For instance, due to the procedure of voting by proxy, which requires to fill in complex forms, it turned out to be a big impediment to people lacking relatives and lacking reading and writing skills. Now they can vote with ballot and booth in the jail.
So we hypothesized based on the literature on prisoners' vote, in particular being in Ireland, that prisoners felt excluded, notably because of the conditions of the vote, which was not like regular citizens, and also because politicians did not reach out to them, didn't conduct political campaigns within prisons, didn't talk to them. And so the difference with the 2019 Act and elections was quite striking to us. And we hypothesized then that they would vote much more than they did in the past, because on the one hand, because of the Brexit debacle, people's attention had been drawn to the EU elections, which ordinarily didn't draw much attention at all. And secondly, because they now voted like ordinary citizens. And thirdly, because there actually was a national debate organized by President Macron, that ended up reaching out to inmates as well, and they participated actively in these debates. So the methodology that we used was very ad hoc, and that's a big limitation because we had only 2 months to negotiate access when we learned that there was going to be this new form of vote for prisoners. So we only accessed 3 prisoners, and it was questionnaire based. But we also conducted an analysis, other than of course of these data, of the electoral European elections, because we ended up accessing the results exclusively for prisoners. And then we were able to compare them with how French citizens voted in general, but also to previous research which describe French public opinion.
So we are going to present the findings. On this slide, you can see that nationally, the number of prisoners who voted increased by a large amount in comparison to previous elections. I let you read the details of the results, but I only would like to underline the fact that the general population and the prisoners' population voted for the extreme right party equally. However, there are some differences. The prisoners, more interested in extreme parties in general, are less interested than the general population in President Macron's party and in the Green Party. However, if we gather all the environmental parties together, we note that both populations are close again as far as voting behavior is concerned. Thanks to the questionnaire, a first qualitative result appeared. The prisoners talk and discuss a lot about politics in their family of origin and or in the new family they might have started. The situation of another result is that the situation of incarceration increased their inclination towards talking of politics for 32% of them. Thanks to this result, we could check and tick 3 criteria of our Bourdieu merge model, that is to say, attachment, commitment, and implication.
And the qualitative results showed other things as well, that the prisoners in questions watched the news every single day, were interested in politics. They spend a lot of time not only watching the news, but talking among themselves as well about politics. Some of them actually more than they did before. And also they were very knowledgeable, and they really shared the idea that it was a democratic process and an important thing to do, a pro-social thing to do, again, ticking 2 of our boxes. So also the sample was very knowledgeable and politically educated. It was quite striking. They really not just absorbed the news narratively and just in terms of information, but they also were capable of discussing quite thoroughly political subjects. And of course, they also were capable even of making sophisticatedly calculated voting plans, which was quite funny to comment on. And so that obviously goes for skills and knowledge in our commitment implication model. More negatively, perhaps, they felt quite excluded. You know, they did participate, but at the same time, they didn't feel worthy of actually expressing an opinion for quite a number of them. And some conclusion.
1 minute remaining.
Yeah, so there you go. We sort of validated our model temporarily. We plan on developing and elaborating on this later in a further study with the presidential election of 2022. Thank you.
Thank you for listening.
So you can drop us an email, obviously.
Thank you. Sorry, I have bad timing knowing when to remind people that there's 1 minute left. Our final paper this morning, Penitentiary Pleasures. Elena, whenever you're ready.
Hi everyone. Let me share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yes.
Okay. And let me do a slideshow. So, hi everyone. My name is Elena Vasiliou. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Cyprus in the Gender Studies program. I will present you the article that I wrote, Penitentiary Pleasures, Queer Understandings of Prison Paradoxes, which is part of my dissertation, and it's about questions of pain and pleasure in prison settings. Here is a visual, this is a visual representation of my work, a kind of summary. I will talk a bit today about my purpose, my positionality, the theoretical framework, the empirical framework, the study, the method of analysis, and my findings. It's important to underline that my work is produced in a totally different geopolitical context. I'm not arguing that this is applicable in US context. Maybe we can tell me some things on that later. I also need to underline that I am not a criminologist. That work is the outcome of my hands-on experience in prison settings as an educator for a period of 5 years. Now, my main argument is that pain and pleasure in prison settings could be understood as a spectrum experience and not as a binary. Traditional criminology study this phenomenon as a binary, but I use queer theory to analyze it as a spectrum experience. In my findings, I identified 3 categories of pleasure: pleasure and pain, pleasure and resistance, and pleasure and sexuality. Now, most classic texts in criminology focus on the sexuality of pain in prison settings. According to Hart, pain is the first element of punishment, and Sykes underlying the 5 pains of imprisonment. And more recently, Limbling writes that prisons is all about pain. However, when I was started interviewing ex-prisoners and expecting to hear them talk about pain, suffering, and the many problems of the penal institutions, I was surprised to find descriptions of pleasure which disrupt a conventional construction of the effects of punishment. In other words, prison produce pain, but it produces also something else. Now, in order to explain this phenomenon, I turn to queer theory. Queer theory challenges binary and normative constructions of gender and sexuality, and it provides an analytic framework for countering assumptions of deviance and non-conformity. My argument is based in the work of 3 queer theories. Today, I will talk only about Foucault. Foucault invests a lot in the concept of pleasure, but not in his work Discipline and Punish. According to Foucault, pleasure produces an effect, is a productive force, is fluid, is desexualized, and could be understood in a very close relationship with resistance. Now, back to prison, there is no systematic framework to understand incidents of pleasure because of the risk to romanticize imprisonment. Some scholars, especially ethnographers, identify some moments of pleasure, but that was framed as surprise or as contradiction. However, while prison scholarship avoid to engage with pleasure in other fields of study and in real life, pain and pleasure is understood in a spectrum than in a binary. Now, the empirical part, the research context, Central Prison of Cyprus accommodates 762 prisoners. In my study, I did some interviews with 21 participants. 17 was ex-prisoners. And my method of analysis, I'm using plugging in theory with data. It's a method of analysis from Jackson and Mazzei, the book Thinking with Theory. First, I used in vivo to classify themes and codes, and then I reread the codes through the plugging in concept of pleasure. The findings are grouped into 3 themes: pleasure and resistance, pleasure and pain, and pleasure and sexuality. I will present you now some incidents from my findings. Robin was 32 years old and had already sentenced 2 sentences when I met him. At the beginning of our interview, he stated, "I can say that I spent my time in there as a king, despite the whole conflict. I like it. If I didn't, I wouldn't have survived me." So basically, you were receiving satisfaction from this conflict with the authorities? Robin, very much. Phileas, another prisoner, Phileas did time in 5 different European prisons. And he said, in prison, you can start any kind of noise, singing, screaming, praying, just for fun, just to make the officers angry. Also, Phileas told me about a collective strike that prisoners did in Cyprus in 2013. I was also working there at that period. And it was the collective strike. It was after the suicide of one prisoner. And Phileas said, "Those days and nights after the death of Elias, we were beaten by the guards and we were starving. But the process of talking collectively, taking decisions and resisting was very exciting." Now, pain and pleasure. I will present only one thing. Getting tattoo and piercing secretly is common among men and women in prisons. Moses explained that testicles is a common place for piercing, but infections and self-harm are also common with these activities. Now, pleasure and sexuality. My purpose here is to understand pleasure in sexual terms, but also beyond sex or beyond sexual activities as such. Gertrude, a 46-year-old woman who was openly lesbian in prison, said that she found comfort in discussions and relationships with other women in prison, even if those relationships were platonic. Here we can see the satisfaction of just talking about sex and a kind of pleasure which is erotic, but not necessarily sexualized. Now, my final thoughts. Pleasure, it's a complicated phenomenon inside and outside prison. In my research, pleasure emerged despite and along with the pain. Physical pain is a manifestation of the emotional pain. And we can explain with that self-harm and other activities. The urge to resist through pleasure and the urge to gain pleasure through resisting is also obvious. And maybe gaining pleasure may occur an urgency for the formation of the prisoner, and that urgency, the psychic entity, could take many directions: to resist, to mock, to sexualize, to be submissive, or to self-harm. You can find the details about my article in that title. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. So we have time now for questions. Stop that for you. Okay. So if you have any questions for our panelists, please feel free to post those in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We have had a couple come in so far, so we'll go through these in order. So Dr. Cate, do you think that Mississippi's count of COVID death numbers are inaccurate? Or do you have any thoughts on how COVID has been worsening the phenomenon in your study?
Thanks so much, Nicole. That's a great question. And those presentations were really awesome. I really enjoyed listening to them. So thank you all. Yes, I mean, I think you probably know that's an obvious answer in a way. It is absolutely being undercounted. As of late October, the director of the Mississippi Department of Corrections said we don't have an outbreak, which is sort of crazy if you think about what's going on nationally and in the state itself. They're not testing widely and they're not following protocols, and that's been added on to all of these existing lawsuits and concerns about inadequate care of the prisoners. And certainly there would not be an accurate assessment of cause of death because of the reasons I mentioned in the presentation. So I absolutely think that COVID will make things much worse in terms of understaffing and just the general lack of medical care, which is only needing to be increased right now. And that is absolutely not happening. So thank you so much. That's a great question.
Thank you. Candice, also from Nicole Kaufman. She writes, amazing presentation. It's so interesting how the labor critique is a constant from organizing in the 1970s to the present. What is the response, if any, from labor movements outside of prisons?
Yeah, that's well, first of all, thank you. And that's really a fantastic question. because of the vast history of movements, I assumed that there would have been more coverage of labor in the newspapers, especially since we've seen that rise and fall of movements over decades, but that really wasn't the case. So I'm still continuing this research, but something I've noticed is that, like most things, there's a tendency to leave incarcerated issues outside of the bigger movements. And I think that's a result of prisons often being tucked away from communities, but also, you know, the most marginalized groups are often the first to be removed. So I will say, though, in the last 5 years, at least, as issues of incarceration have kind of become more mainstream, there seems to be more of an intentional effort to connect the plight of incarcerated workers with laborers across communities. So I think and I hope that folks are finally starting to make the obvious connections between that collective effort toward liberation. So I think we'll see some shifting in the next couple of years.
Thank you. I have a follow-up question for you, Candice. So, like, at least in the US, and this might apply to Jerome and Martine as well. In the US, we've seen a push in some states where incarcerated people do have the right to vote, from outside organizations to register voters. I know at least like locally with some of the groups I work with in northeastern Pennsylvania, that's been a big issue. And we know nationally, like Florida's been in the news a lot for it as well. I was just curious if any of that has come up in your work, thinking about like, oh, I'm not even sure how to ask this. I guess just trying to build that bridge. Has that come up at all?
Sure, yeah. So something that I'm interested, I've kind of always, well, not necessarily always kept it separate as a research topic, but that voting justice for incarcerated folks, it's been quite interesting because most of the research I've come across has been from formerly incarcerated folks kind of organizing and not necessarily currently incarcerated folks in prisons. The conversation of incarcerated folks organizing in jails has risen up, but not necessarily prisons. But I do think there's space to make the connection there, especially as we continue like this movement building. But yeah, to answer your question, so far I haven't really been able to make the connection between the two in like one specific paper, but it definitely exists. So that's something we could explore.
Thank you. Okay, here we go. So for you, Elena, Lucy writes, I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit on the context in which your study took place. How does the prison look or possibly feel like? How does it objectively provide opportunities for pleasures or pain through specific events, activities, policies on the everyday level? There you go.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I think it's hard to explain in a few minutes the context in which my research took place, but it's definitely Cyprus has a totally different system, and it's a very small country, so we have only one prison. It's one prison who feeds all prisoners, and I don't know if we can really discuss about that thing objectively. I think exactly my point is that according to Foucault, pleasure it's something fluid. So I was like surprised to see I don't know, let's say descriptions of self-harm in which contain a kind of satisfaction or a kind of pleasure through catharsis. Now, about the specific events or activities, policies on the everyday level in prison, yeah, I think we can discuss a lot about how that research is connected to collective strikes, how also the action of voting that the previous researchers referred to. So I think the concept of pain and pleasure, pain and resistance could apply in a lot of discussions in prison and in practical things that they are taking place in prison settings. I don't know if I was clear enough.
All right, thank you. So we're out of time for today. Thank you again to all of our panelists for your incredible work. Thank you again for everybody in attendance. And a reminder, this stream is sponsored today by Southern Illinois University Press. Somebody had a question, I'm sorry. Hearing nothing. Okay.
No, I was saying it was me. I just said cheers and thanks.
Oh, okay.
Apologies for jumping in.
All right. Hearing things. Thank you all again. And thank you for coming out to CrimCon. Enjoy the rest of the conference. If you're sticking around for
Thank
our
you very much. Thank you very much.
reboot the webinar, and I'll see everybody in 10 minutes.
Nice day.
Bye.
Bye.